Ah, hello there. You just caught me whilst I was thinking about classes. Not the social structures that cause so much problems in Wuthering Heights and also world history. No! I instead was thinking about the ones that are in our beloved TTRPGs, that add colour and customization to your character creation. And it started to get me thinking what the history was of classes, where they came from, the origin behind each specific class, and what makes a good or a bad class. So, if you're like me and you've wondered why rangers are all the rage, how you go about fighting a fighter, and what gives the barbarian the audacity to be so barbaric, then stick around, because we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Badger Tales, the home of storytellers. I'm Felix Twingren, and today we're starting off our Badger Talks series. Badger Talks is kind of an insert name at the moment. We've been considering other names such as Badger Rambling or Stop Badgering Me. We'll settle on something eventually. For the moment, we're Badger Talks, and in this series we're going to cover a series of just general, more broad topics in the worlds of TTRPGs, mythology, storytelling, and everything in between. And in this video, we're going to be talking about classes, specifically 3 core points. We're going to look at the history of TTRPGs as a whole, going right back to the first instances of class systems appearing. We're going to be looking at the origin and history, both cultural, mythological, and literary, behind each of the classes that we like so much. And finally, we're going to be examine what makes a good or a bad class, and where perhaps the TTRPG industry should be moving or shifting as things change in the future. Now, a little bit of honesty. This video is somewhat in response to the backlash we received on our recent Daggerheart review video. In that video, I expressed my dislike for some of the elements of the Daggerheart domain system, and I want to clarify a little bit about that before I move forward. First of all, I actually really like the domain system as a whole. What I didn't like was specific moments where it clashed and hyper-focused, creating versions of classes that I felt didn't allow for versatility and character freedom, specifically referring to the rogue and the seraph. To be clear, the Daggerheart rogue is awesome. It's really cool. It's one of the closest versions of like an Odysseus-style rogue that we've seen in a long time, and I really enjoy it. My problem with it is not that it's a bad rogue. My problem with it is that it prevents you from being any other kind of rogue than the version that they have created there. With that in mind, the one I really should have been getting upset about is the Seraph. I touched on that very briefly in the video, but that one is a much greater victim of this kind of hyper-focus mentality. We're going to get into that when we get to the section about what makes a good or a bad class, but I want to just reiterate that we are stepping back and we were maybe a bit too harsh on the Daggerheart rogue. And I overall adore Daggerheart. I think it's because I like Daggerheart so much and because it gives so much freedom in all other areas that the class system failing to give more player freedom was sort of like upsetting. It made me feel like I was missing out on something that could have really brought the whole package lovely together. Second disclaimer is, we of course have our own opinions. In Badger Tales, we prefer story and narrative driven elements to TTRPGs. The games we play are the ones driven by story first and foremost. Therefore, a lot of our opinions are skewed towards that element. If you're more of like a high rules-based gamer, you might not agree with a lot of what we're saying, and that's fine. We want to talk with you guys and we want to debate with you. Jump into the comment section with anything I say in this video and debate the hell out of it, because I really want to talk back and we'll have that conversation. So please comment and we'll chat away about what makes these RPGs special and what makes these class systems work or fail. Now, we will say as well, this video is going to be quite D&D oriented. That's because, as you'll see when we get to the history section, D&D was kind of the founder and the pusher of the class system, at least in the vein that we see in TTRPGs, and therefore they were one of the core initiators of pushing forwards class systems that we know and see everywhere else. The core classes that D&D brought to the table are the ones that were picked up by video games, by other TTRPGs, and so on and so forth. So, to not consider D&D as the founding point of this is to lose sight of that. This does not mean that we think that D&D has the best class offering or the best class naming and structure in far as it comes to TTRPGs. In fact, there's a lot of room for improvement in a huge amount of areas. With that out of the way, what is a class? Well, the best way to define a class is a group of mechanics and systems put together to create a package that is an easily identifiable archetype or trope within media, within history, within culture, mythology, literacy, all of that. The main objective of a class is to give you a role or purpose within a party so that you can work to your strengths and also have weaknesses that other people can work and fix within the party themselves. Now, it's also important to stress that classes are not something just found in D&D or fantasy games. They transcend into a number of other games. If we look, for example, at one of my favorite games, Vampire the Masquerade, I would classify the Vampire clan system as a class system. The reason? Well, each of the vampire clans very neatly fit into that description I put earlier of little packages of abilities and lore and little mechanics that enable you to play something that you've seen before. In this case, that being vampires throughout literacy. When you play Vampire the Masquerade, by looking at the clans, you can quickly jump into any version of a vampire that you enjoy and get a really nice experience from it. For example, you want to play more of a vampire Lestrat from Interview with a Vampire. Yeah, well then maybe Toreador is more for you, or possibly even Ventru. You want to play a ragged, more sort of monstrous vampire, perhaps one of the sort of wild creatures on the edge of society, well then a Gangrel would suit you better. You want to play the twisted creature from Nosferatu, well, Nosferatu clan is designed just for that. In this way, the game prioritizes role-playing but builds it into a class system, thereby giving you the class as a core marker of your identity, which is a path to take it. If we look at modern games as well, such as Cyberpunk, you see the same repeating patterns of classes emerge there, with things like the Solo and the Netrunner, where you begin to get more physical characters and more intellectual or psychic-based characters going into a different realm. Generally on this vine, we tend to find that there are the big three, the main core classes that are the ones that reappear in video games, in TTRPGs, and so on and so forth. These three tend to be the warrior, the wizard, and the thief. If you pull those back and look at what they actually are, it's a physical character, a mental character, and an agile or dexterous character. With these big three, we can pretty much build off into any archetype we want. Of course then, it starts getting more complex when you broaden out and you get more and more and more options. We see this appearing also in modern games, like for example, if you look at Shadowrun, you get a melee build there, a sort of a Netrunner style psychic or mage build, and also thief classes like assassins and rogues. This is because these templates fit the core playstyles that everyone wants to play generally. When class systems are working at their best, they enable players to have a core identity to themselves, as well as playing off one another and accounting for each other's strengths and weaknesses. When they're their worst, they hyper-focus and restrict players and prevent them from becoming their full potential. It's important to know, though, that classes at the end of the day are an interpretation of a specific cultural understanding, and because of that, they're prone to pitfalls of misrepresentation, misunderstanding, or far too specific interpretation. That's important to recognize, and it's something that we'll be looking at a lot today. It's also important to know that good TTRPGs don't need class systems. There's a lot of great games out there that don't use class systems at all, and that is a perfectly legitimate way of building characters. There's benefits to class systems and there's benefits to not, and we'll also be getting to that in our final section of this video. But with that out of the way, let's have a look at the history of TTRPGs and where the class system first emerged. The history of class systems goes as far back as wargaming. If you want to go even further, it kind of ends up in stuff like chess, with defined units that have purposes and goals, weaknesses and strength. This emerges more in wargaming scene that appears in the sort of 70s and 60s, whereby you classify units based on infantry, cavalry, archers, and some of them getting specific benefits and strengths. As this wargaming scene began to grow more complex, it started becoming become more classified, with each of these different sections getting more and more abilities for them. This reaches its head with the first emergence of the good old Gary Gygax. Gary Gygax worked with Jeff Perrin on a game called Chainmail, a wargaming game that had a fantasy supplement allowing people to play with fighting men, wizard casters, and also superheroes. These superhero characters being hero characters that had abilities to add to the battle, making things change on the fly as they moved and attacked throughout. This initial movement began to highlight the want for people to play as individual characters who had shaping impact on the story rather than large bodies of troops. This experience was expanded upon by Gygax and Dave Arneson in their game Blackmoor, which took this concept and brought it to the next level, allowing people to play as characters that recurred in a game after game after game. Slowly, we're beginning to see the structure that would eventually become Dungeons & Dragons. In this early version of Blackmoor, there were only 3 classes: fighting men, wizards or magic casters, and clerics. Now immediately you might be like, that's a bit odd. I heard you say that the original 3 classes were fighter, magic caster, and thief. Yes and no. Those 3 are the core that have come through afterwards and the ones we tend to go back to, but initially, because we were coming from the wargaming space, we had a more war-orientated mentality, with the focus on fighting men as being the melee character, magic casters being a magical-based character, and clerics acting as a sort of in-between class designed to support and buff the people around them. It's fair to say Gygax loved Blackmoor and began to expand upon it himself with his own game Greyhawk, which was a campaign setting using Blackmoor, but in a more historical setting that he enjoyed more. It wasn't until 1974 that we saw the release of Dungeons & Dragons, the first ever edition, and in the beginning it was known as the White Box. It was actually an addition or a supplement to Chainmail, adding new rules to allow you to take the Chainmail rules and work on your own with individual adventurers rather than an army. In fact, you couldn't play Dungeons & Dragons without the Chainmail supplement that fitted into the initial white box that you bought. Without Chainmail, you wouldn't have rules for initiative and various other ways of tracking hit points, so this was a core aspect of the experience. Still at this point, we were stuck with the 3 main classes of fighting man, magic caster, and cleric. In 1975, there was an edition released to Dungeons & Dragons that added Gary Gygax's Greyhawk campaign to it, and with it came the thief class. At this stage, they could see the desire of people to play as different roles that they were coming across in pulp fantasy novels. Despite this, it wasn't until 1977 that Dungeons & Dragons actually released other playable races in the forms of dwarves, elves, and halflings, but at this stage, they were not actually a class and race choice together. In fact, playing as an elf was a full class on its own, and the other races were intently restricted on which direction they could go. They couldn't take on other classes, for example. They were stuck in their own little route. This was a hyper-focused version of classification. People who played elves had to play like the elves that they came across in Lord of the Rings. People who played as halflings were expected to play like the halflings in Lord of the Rings. There was very little room for fluid creativity here, but that was about to change. In 1979, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was released, and it is here that the myriad of other classed options burst into life. Suddenly, you could play as a ranger, an illusionist, a bard, and more. This is when the beginning of the core fantasy trope classes were set in stone, and from here, each of them began to shift along this path. That's not saying that these didn't work. There's a reason, like I said before, why these were so desired. People wanted to play a ranger because they had seen rangers before. They had seen Robin Hood, they had seen Legolas, they had seen so on and so forth. So allowing players to be able to access and play these tropes that they enjoyed was a big step forwards in the role-playing part of Dungeons & Dragons. Later TTRPGs drew from this initial lineup of classes, and it's for that reason that D&D became the staple and the standard regarding classes moving forward. It's really important to remember that Dungeons & Dragons did not invent these archetypes, it only popularized them in the format that it had them in. When second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons came out, it brought with it the innovation of kits, allowing you to specify your class down a specific route. With this came the beginning of subclasses, allowing you to take your fighting man and turn him into a gladiator, to take your thief and make them into an assassin. Since then, subclasses have been a core part of most TTRPG experiences and are a very good way of allowing for creativity and freedom within the restrictive nature of classes. Most of the time, I would say, people actually look to the ending subclass before they choose their class. Hey, you want to play a pirate? You want to be a swashbuckler? That means you've got to play a rogue. That's usually the pathway people's minds go, rather than any set pirate class that allows you to become X, Y, and Z. This is why it's always struck me as a little bit strange that D&D has only ever given its subclasses at level 3. Surely, if this is a defining aspect of your character and their story, it should be something that comes with the core of creating the character. That's just in my opinion though. I want to take this moment to reiterate, not all games use class systems, and if you create a fantasy TTRPG, you do not need to have a class system. There's a lot of great games that use other methods, such as the Cypher system or the Fate system, which entirely rely on prompts to create your character, giving you much more freedom. Other games like City of the Mist or Legend in the Mist allow you to take playbooks that you apply to your character that give a broad idea of a trope or a focus or a set of abilities that you then work towards. There's benefits to both of these. Being class structured means that you have a very strong archetype you can work off, as well as progressive abilities that are balanced and controlled, enabling you to fulfill your fantasy of your character. However, they come with strong restrictions as they need to be balanced, so therefore you can often find that your full vision of your character is never fully fulfilled. Whilst broader systems allow you to be pretty much anything you can envision, it comes with the caveat of it doesn't work quite as well when it comes to the nitty gritty crunchy munchy of fighting, and that is where the core comes through. Fighting is where you need mechanical synergy, and that is where classes most come into their own. If you look at most of the games that forego class systems, they tend to turn fighting scenes into more of an imaginative display, rather than a hyper-structuralized, grid-based combat. Now that we've learned about the history of TTRPG class systems, we're now going to take a look at the origin of the history behind each of the various classes that we know and love. Once again, we're going to be focusing on the Dungeons & Dragons ones here, not because the Dungeons & Dragons ones are the best ones, but because they're the staple and they give us a lot to learn and look at in regards to considering classes and how they have affected our TTRPGs. Moving on to the origin of classes. Many of the classes that we now have, as we've already stated, come from history, myth, culture, and literature. But where have we misinterpreted them, and where have we changed them? We're now going to have a look at each of the classes and look at them in a context of culture, mythology, literature, and history. And the first on the chopping block is one of my favourite classes, but also one that I have kind of the most problems with, and that is the Barbarian. Now, when you picture the Barbarian, you probably picture something a lot like Conan, a figure who is unarmored, driven by rage, slashing their way through the enemy lines, on and on and on. But what you might not know is that the name Barbarian does not actually come from this. Barbarian actually comes from the Greek word barbaros, and it was not used to describe this typical northern blade-swinging, unarmored figure. In fact, if we translate barbaros, what it comes down to is essentially saying babbling, or people who speak and sound like they're saying bar. Hence it eventually became barbarian. And it's from here that we see the discrepancies between our vision of a barbarian and what the Greeks might have envisioned themselves. Generally, when the Greeks were using the word barbarian, they were describing their age-old enemy, the Persians. That enemy that they faced at Marathon, Plataea, and Thermopylae. See, the Persians were actually an incredibly enlightened civilization, having made massive movements in architecture, astrology, mathematics, medicine, and much more. It was only at a later point when the Romans, who were obsessed with adopting everything Greek, took that word barbarian and started to use it to apply to the people that they met in the north, the Gauls, the Keltoi, the Visigoths, and the Goths. And this is where that image of the barbarian that we know begins to emerge. Of course, you may be aware, history is written by the victors. and it was the victors who wrote about the peoples they conquered. Rome, when they came across these people, depicted them as wild, uncivilized, animalistic figures, hence the image of this barbarian beginning to come together. There is a problem with this, though, is not only was it based on inaccuracies, but it was also based on downright propaganda. You see, it was in the best interest of Julius Caesar to portray the Celts and the Gauls that he came across as barbaric, wild, animalistic people, because this allowed him to continue his campaign. The longer popular support continued to be in his favour, the longer he continued to be able to keep fighting and therefore hold his position as a consul and the power it gave him over the army. Modern sources actually tell us that the Celts and the Gauls were very different from this depiction as well. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that these figures who took off their armour and painted themselves in woads, screaming and charging into battle, it was more of a display of bravery rather than fury. What's more, the Celts had a deeply complex tribal structure with nobles and peasants and fortified settlements and much more. It was the Roman depictions that were picked up and then brought into the cultural subconscious that became what we then depicted as a barbarian, and that grew and grew and grew and grew over the years. Now, where this becomes interesting is this is a very narrow depiction of a barbarian. Yes, if we look to mythology, we can find a lot of figures that fit our typical barbarian. For example, Heracles, Gilgamesh, or Samson. All of these are generally depicted armorless, with great colossal strength and fury that takes over them. Heracles in particular was known for his wrath and his fury. However, some core characters that I would associate with wrath are not within this spectrum of the barbarian. The two of these that most spring to mind being Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, Homer's epic war poem, and Cuchulainn, the hero of the Ulster Cycle's Tan Baculia, this war against Connacht and Queen Maeve and Allo. Both of these two figures are highly characterized by their wrath and rage. Achilles so much to the case that the Iliad actually opens up with the phrase, "Sing, O goddess, of the wrath of Achilles." Wrath is inbuilt into his very nature. When Patroclus falls, it is the wrath that drives Achilles to cut a sway through the Trojan army, slaughter Hector, and drag him around the walls of Troy before coming back. Cuchulainn too is defined by his rage, getting so angry that one eye pops wide upon his head, his hair springs on end, and he is granted with powerful strength and fortitude. The interesting thing about both of these, as you may see from the picture, is they're both generally depicted with spear and shield and heavily armoured, just as the nobilities of each of their times would have been. Now, it's very possible to play as something similar to both of these characters in D&D, however, it often feels like the systems are working against you. This is folded over into popular fantasy media, where our depiction is now the very set one of the barbarian that we have drawn from our sources, etc. I find this very interesting because for me, the core archetype that we find enjoyable about the barbarian is the rage. So opening it up and making it more inclusive would allow for more access to other characters that embody that rage, giving characters more options. Once again, I am not saying that D&D or other depictions of the barbarian is bad. That is a great fun archetype to play. Many people, including myself, really enjoy playing the wild man barbarian who charges in with very low to no armor and slashes their way through enemy lines, taking hits. That's awesome. That's really, really cool. I'm simply saying that it's worth understanding the historical context so we know that this is a narrow depiction of what rage embodies in myth and culture. Moving on to our next one, and sticking with the Celts, we're going to look at the Druid. The Druid in D&D and in other popular fantasy media is portrayed as an embodiment or a connecting point between nature. Druids have access to the vast power of nature, usually allowing them to shapeshift, transform into animals, speak with animals, commune with nature, and cast natural magic. This is a fantastic little package of abilities that players really get invested in and want to play. This is really interesting because it clashes with the reality of druids in history. See, druids actually occupied quite a different position. They acted as advisors, diplomats, healers and teachers within the community, as well as being a religious connection point. In fact, druids were part of the upper class, much closer to a priest or a monk than a lone hermit wandering through the woods connecting with nature. This again is due to historical misrepresentations or propaganda. This again is due to history being written by the victors in this case being Rome, but also Christianity. Christianity wanted to portray the pagan religions as outwardly strange, mysterious, and on the edge of society. At that point of time, civilization was a bastion, something to be proud of and to be connected to, so to portray the druids as something on the fringe of society, more bestial and animalistic, lessened them. Added to this, they were connected to other Celtic myths of the Dagda and the Cat Sith or the Puka, creatures that were capable of transforming their shape into various animal forms and having mystical abilities connected to nature. The funny thing is, if you wanted to play a more historical druid, you'd be better going down the pathway of a cleric, becoming a priest-like figure within the community. What we're left with the druid, however, is a delightful package of abilities and an archetype that we have come to romanticize and connect with in fantasy. It really works because we immediately say druid and are able to connect it with all these abilities that people want to play. Tabletop role-playing games are fantasy. They're not direct historical games, so you don't need to play as a historical druid. That's not what we're saying. By understanding the word druid now and its origin, we understand the chokehold that D&D and other fantasy has had on our perception of these figures. Moving on to the cleric. The cleric was one of the initial 3 classes that was created by D&D and has been quite heavily changed by that fact. See, the majority of the cleric's abilities are connected to bonding to a single god that gives powers. The original cleric in D&D, however, was based around being a monster hunter, an anti-undead, something slightly in between a warrior and a wizard, and sort of coming across as well that kind of warrior monk style thing. Now, warrior monks did exist in real history, but quite rarer than we give it credit for. Typically in fantasy media, we often depict the cleric fighting with a blunt weapon, something that was a restriction to the early cleric class. The myth that is the reason for this comes from the historical idea of the no blood rule, a rule within the Catholic Church that forbade their priests from shedding blood. The myth is that clergymen got around this by using blunt weapons. However, blunt weapons often cause severe, violent, bloody damage, and this would not be a realistic rule. The main depiction we have to back up this myth is of Bishop Odo of Bayeux, which is on the Bayeux Tapestry, and depicts the bishop himself holding a club or mace at the Battle of Hastings. Many historians, though, suggest that this was not to avoid blood, but he was using it simply as an effective weapon for a rider to use. Maces and blunt weapons were used by knights across the known world at this point. It is more likely that a number of priests simply ignored the no blood rule, if it was even heavily enforced to begin with. Knights of all descriptions fought with blunt weapons. It was the best way of damaging someone wearing all that armor, so it doesn't make sense that we've connected the cleric with this blunt weapon focus. It is also fair to say that our vision of the cleric has been heavily influenced by a monotheistic presentation of religion. We like to look at religion and think of single gods that connect to a single ideology. The reality of polytheistic religions, or many god religions, which is what we see in most fantasy settings, is that polytheistic religions allow for adaptability in worship. Polytheism is actually much more adaptable than monotheism, and we see this a lot with our ancient sources when Rome actually takes the goddess Isis from Egypt and adopts her into their pantheon. This is really interesting from 2 fronts, because although it makes the cleric maybe less accurate, however, it does make it much more mechanically viable and mechanically identifiable. It is much more difficult to have a cleric that would be closer to the original image of a cleric that worshipped all gods, because then it would have access to all abilities, or it would be a much messier thing to control. It's much easier to make into a game principle if you have clerics bonded to one god, gaining all of their abilities connected to that god itself. For example, you want to worship the god of fire. Great, you'll get access to fire abilities, and you'll get access to all of these kinds of things connected to your deity. You want to be access to the goddess of shadows, or the god of goodness and light, and so on and so forth. Paladins sit in an adjacent vein to clerics because it was, for a while, they were kind of different to separate. A paladin more embodies the myths of Arthurian knights, crusaders, and of course the Knights of Charlemagne, which is where we get the word paladin from. Our modern depiction of paladins relies on the oath aspect, and this was something we do see in the mythology as well. If we look at Arthurian knights and Charlemagne's knights, a lot of what it was based on was providing an oath to your liege lord or making an oath towards God. This then emboldened the knights to achieve great things or go out questing. Sir Galahad takes it upon himself to search for the Holy Grail. This is also reflected in the historical representation of knights, who often had to make oaths of chivalry or oaths to their king. Now, the reality of these oaths was 90% of them were actually connected with your duties to your king, rather than moral obligations, and it's kind of true that not all knights really stick to this. One of the best examples that kind of highlights this is Game of Thrones' more historical depiction of knights, where they are meant to uphold a certain vision of chivalry and then in reality are actually quite different. Often with these two attitudes smashing together to make them quite hypocritical figures. The monk is one of the harder classes to talk about. This is because the monk is based on an obsession with Asian martial arts and other things like this that have been inflated to a large degree, almost to the point where it has created cultural misunderstandings and lack of sensitivity. Though historical Shaolin monks did practice martial arts, it is more likely that this was down to a self-discipline and spiritual connection, with a very, very small occasions that it came into self-defense or defense. It is the later depictions of martial artists that imbued them with supernatural powers connected to their martial arts, giving them super speed, the ability to catch and deflect missiles, and so on and so forth. I feel very hesitant to go much further on the discussion of the monk, as most of my historical experience and expertise comes from a Western place. I think it summarizes exactly one of the biggest problems with the monk, and actually our definition of classes altogether. One of the biggest problems we have with TTRPG classes is that the core basis of most of our classes are coming from Western depictions and Western archetypes. Therefore, when you have a character like the monk, it doesn't fully fit with the cultural nuances. Martial arts are found everywhere in history and across the globe, but there is no denying that the current depiction of monk in most TTRPGs is based on a Western fascination with Eastern culture. A more inclusive class, in my mind, would focus on the nature of martial arts itself, expanding upon abilities that allowed one to take full control of their body, rather than being cultural specific. This might be something we do a video to expand on, but for the moment, I feel currently unqualified to press this much further. Because of this cultural misunderstanding, a lot of fantasy has been moving away from the titles of monk and key, with D&D itself changing key to be focus, and Daggerheart changing monk altogether to be a brawler. Next up we have the Bard, an extremely popular class, and one that takes our medieval depiction of a troubadour or performer and meshes it with the court jester and joker, pinning these together to make a charisma class that is heavily based on using your music to convey or create magic. This depiction has been around for a long time and connects with our slight overlapping of these two roles. The reality is a troubadour or a musical performer was more of a music-based structured role on its own, and with the court fool being its own role that occasionally had musical talent or did other things musical. These two together is a little bit of a strange combination, but it's one that is instantly identifiable and recognizable and is very enjoyable to play. With that in mind, as we look back further, we see ancient or older depictions of bards that are a bit more grounded and serious. We see characters like Orpheus from Greek mythology or Taliesin from Welsh, who have great powers over music to woo, to convince and to charm people, but rarely with a mischievous or playful element. That trickster element actually tends to come from more roguish characters, and we see a little bit of an overlap with the rogue in that department. There is a fascinating undercurrent to that, which is that in the ancient world, The power of retelling stories and having defining control on history was an extremely powerful force indeed. In fact, bards were said to have the power to destroy reputations and bring down great lineages because they could simply change or adapt the histories. It's also true that through art you see things that are hidden to others, so a bard being able to expose or reveal hypocrisy was an incredible potent skill indeed. The D&D representation of the bard tries to envision this jack-of-all-trades, jester-type figure, rather than a historical standing point and a cultural key aspect in society. Bards in mythology and history were less stumbling fools and more custodians of the past, as well as captivating entertainers. Bards in history were generally enclosed within a court, a set position that was of vital importance. It was only later romanticization that turned them into wandering minstrels. There is some of this we see with seneschai, who used to travel around Ireland telling their stories to different courts, but even then, they were regarded as highly valued members of courts who would stay for a long time. There is also a lot to be said for the mythical understanding and respect for the power of words. The power of words was once very highly regarded, with oaths and binding pledges being something that ancient people viewed as something very real indeed. This is the basis not only for the bard, but much of the vocal component of spells themselves. Learning the true name of things or knowing the words behind them would give you access to the power that brought them to bear. This comes to bear as the fantasy bard seems to bear more resemblance to a trickster deity, your Ananses and your Odysseus's, something very adjacent to what the rogue fills as well. It seems natural then, with this adjacency to the rogue, to move on to the rogue, a word that encompasses a great deal of influences. The best way I've come to describe the rogue, both in combat and out of, is someone who acts non-conventionally, either using tactics like stealth or dirty fighting to try and get the upper hand, or in social situations stealing or tricking their way to their objective. Historically, we see a vast variety of these people who worked outside of the law, be they thieves, bandits, spies, assassins, and more. All of these are folded into the encompassing picture of rogue. And of course, we have romanticized these images quite a lot. The depiction we have now of a bandit or a traveling rogue is actually a far cry from the extremely difficult and painful life someone living historically in that condition would have. That being said though, mythologically, we see the rogue popping up a lot of ways, and generally this falls into the trickster hero archetype. Characters like Odysseus, Loki, and even Maui to a degree. These figures use their wit, charm, and other techniques to get to what they want. Where this gets really interesting is that we rarely find criminals in the mythological world that are shown positively. Generally, it's a trickster vibe which is adjacent but not quite overlapping. It is only our modern romanticization of the bandit and the outlaw that has led to this kinder depiction of the rogue that has since formed into assassins and such. Generally, historically, these were not positive depictions. Odysseus especially is fascinating in this regard because he fits the bracket of being someone who breaks the conventional heroic stereotypes. There's a lot of interesting discussion about the Odyssey and the Iliad as two comparative books where the Iliad espouses the kleos or glorious attributes of a character like Achilles, whilst Odysseus hardens down the reality required to survive in a difficult and complex world. The unknown world is dangerous to Odysseus, so he must navigate it rather than with his strength and might, but with his cunning and skill and his ruthless ability to go above and beyond. So too does truth become objective to these characters. These characters are capable of lying, twisting, and manipulating, thus demonstrating their willingness to fight unconventionally. It's also interesting to think about the fact that most of the historical mythological remains that we have brought to us were written by the upper class as they had access to literacy. There may be hundreds of rogue heroes, folk heroes, and characters that have been lost to the ages that more fit the archetype of a rogue that we now personify. Today, we find ourselves drawn to Robin Hood, heist movies, and more, as the rogue embodies our desire to subvert the systems in power and fight our way. The Ranger, however, embodies an element of survivalism. Where the rogue is meant to be nasty and tricky, the Ranger instead embodies people like scouts, actual real-life hunters and rangers, people who go into the natural world, and rather than being at one with it quite to the degree the druid is, they have mastery of it, able to survive within it and overcome it, whilst also being connected to it in some way. Most depictions of rangers we have now do give them that mystical aspect of connecting with nature whilst also surviving through it. We often find, because of all these depictions, the ranger tends to have a bow as well, further cementing them with the idea of the hunting that is so connected with their archetype. Characters like Robin Hood often sit somewhere between the rogue and the ranger, connecting with the morally ambiguous, but also the quiet dignity of being alone in nature and being able to make mastery of it. Robin Hood himself, though, is a much darker figure who often connects with that rogue element, even having certain stories where he kills Guy Gisborne and sticks his head on the top of his bow, swinging it around. Not something we would normally look at with our typical ranger depiction. The best mythological depiction I can give of the ranger tends to be Atalanta from Greek mythology. Atalanta was cast out by her family and raised by bears, becoming stronger and deadlier, faster than everyone else. She has such a bonding power with nature and a connection with the bow that she is the one to wound the Caledonian boar in the great boar hunt that brings heroes from across the Greek world. There is also a lot of overlap with the ranger's traveling companion or their beast companion, with stories of spiritual guides and connective spirits with animal, that kind of thing, though we rarely ever see people in mythology or history with animal companions. It's a bit of a rarer trope. The ancient depiction of nature is much more vicious and wild than our own. To the people of the past, the natural world was a dangerous and unknown thing, something that sat on the edge of civilization and that every time you entered was putting yourself in some danger. This is why nature is such a breeding ground for some of our early mythological horror stories. If you really think about it, all a monster is nature in its rawest and most deadly form. Whilst in civilization, man remains the top dog, out in the wilderness, we are reduced to simply a rung on the food chain. Our modern depictions of the rangers often veer close to a druid, sort of as a protector of the wild, rather than someone who is a guide through it. Ultimately, though, surviving in the wild is a brutal and difficult affair. Through the ranger, we can embody the ideals of independence throughout chaos, relying on skill and your own self-sufficiency, in a world where one mistake could mean death. The ranger's tendency to be associated with the animal companion abilities sums up its relationship and its romanticization today completely. Here we see man and nature working in perfect unity, a friendship bonded that is beyond words. Finally, we are left with the fighter and the wizard, sorcerer, and warlock, which all kind of fit into the same vein. The fighter sits on its own as pretty much the fighting man. There's little much more I can say about a fighter other than all cultures have their warriors. All cultures have had people that have fought and killed across human history. One of the reasons why I think the fighter is such a good class is because it is so dynamic and freeing. Many of the characters I have just mentioned could be built really well with a fighter, just role-playing the elements in between. For this reason, the fighter is one of my absolute favorite classes. The archetype is loose but also narrow enough that it encompasses such a wide range of options and simply gives you the tools to play them. The Battlemaster class, for example, providing a whole host of different maneuvers that you could homebrew and adjust to fit whatever kind of fighting style you might be employing. The fighter, as one of the big three core classes, also appears in most TTRPGs in some form because of this very reason. I always come back on people who say that the fighter is boring, because in my mind, it is absolutely the opposite. It's the foundation allowing you to build whatever you want. You simply have to have the creativity to seize it. The magic classes hearken to a range of different depictions that we have through magical depictions in society. Magic, just like fighting, is something that transcends all cultures, and is one of the reasons why I have lumped all three of the remaining magic classes together, as it's very difficult to expand on them without this bloating out into an entire full new video on its own. Needless to say, there is deeply complex cultural and historical underlines to all of the different magical interpretations. This will be something that in the future we expand on and we go to talk about with its own video, for just like the fighter concept, the concept of magic itself has expanded across all human history from all cultures around the globe. These depictions vastly vary, but tend to align on some core aspects that we'll go into here. The first of which being that usually, in most of these early versions, casters or magic users are acting as liminal guides between the known and the unknown, magic acting as an access of knowledge or skills beyond someone's understanding. Thus, a lot of early myths of these characters have them as gatekeepers of grand knowledge or wisdom beyond the typical understanding. In its broad strokes, though, magic tends to sit between two different domains of a close healing magic that has some connection to a divinity or some liminal skills beyond what is known and unknown. For example, the root of our divination wizard come from characters like the Sibyl in Greek history, Cassandra from the Troy epic, and Tiresias from the Odyssey. Figures who are granted their foresight through tainted gifts or machinations of the gods. Magic is often, though, seen as a warping or a tainting of the cultural status quo, with many magician or witch or wizard type characters being viewed as nefarious people using magic and making deals with underhand beings. Much of the more recent depictions of witches depicts them as making deals with the devil itself to grant them their magic, thus connecting with our concept of the warlock. This unknown or underhand quality has often been prescribed to women throughout the years, a reflection of the fear of feminine powers in a masculinely dominated world. Thus, sorceresses like Morgan Le Fay, Circe, and more act as gatekeepers of feminine secrets and access to magic beyond the men's control. Indeed, in the Odyssey, we come across Helen of Troy, back in her home with her husband Menelaus, and there we see her described as a magician or caster of some sort, and yet all of her casting is conducted through herbs, powders, and other things, more closely associating with our idea of alchemy than casting. This too connects to the immersion of the concept of components for spells, possibly the root of this being using healing herbs, psychedelics, and more to create supernatural effects in the eyes of the people who did not understand them. This then comes to bear when we see people who are outsiders cast in the vein of a witch or a caster in order to make sense of their unknown qualities. It is important to note with the witch, though, that both men and women were accused and tortured for being witches, and it was not a gender-based thing as we might think. There has also over the years been more culturally accepted routes into magic, such as the rise of alchemy, where upper-class noblemen worked to try and find the mechanisms by which to turn things into gold. A number of these magical stereotypes suffer from the same things that happened to the Druids and the Barbarians, cultural aspects that have been retwisted by winning factions within history. The earliest version of the witch can in fact be translated to Wicca, meaning wise person in Old English. Much of our modern Western depiction of magic is negative due to the influences of the monotheistic religion of Christianity. In the eyes of a monotheism, you cannot have any power that questions the power of the one and only. Therefore, these things must be associated with the demonic or the monstrous. We do see a lot of magic emerging amongst communities that tends to be sort of anti-magic, taking the form of charms, protective marks, and symbols to cast out evil. These generally work, however, due to their connection to the divine and invoking a divine intervention, or is down to their supposed purity. For example, iron and salt were thought to undermine the actions of the Fae due to the perception of them as pure and untainted. This is, of course, a gross simplification of the vast complexity of the portrayal of magic across cultures. There are many positive depictions, many negative ones. Like I said, we'll be going into this further in a later video that will discuss the deeper history and mythology of magic through time. The funny thing about drawing magic from fantasy is that fantasy has constantly changing depictions of magic systems within the various books that come out. I think this is one of the reasons why we have ended up with so many different magical classes to allow access to different magical systems, as well as different ways of role-playing your role and access to magic. The reason I feel like it's important to talk about these depictions and understand all of the depictions we've just talked about is to understand that they are depictions. They should be changed, adapted, twisted to suit the needs that we want as we grow and change. It's one of the reasons why I really like what Draw Steel is doing, completely changing all of the words of all of its classes. I watched a video recently with Matt Colville where he was talking about how it was so interesting to see people saying, well, where's your cleric? Where's your druid? Where's your this? Those are all constructs. By changing the name on the ability package, you can actually provide much more room to expand into new abilities and broaden the perception of what one thing or another thing could be. Understanding the history and origins of TTRPG classes is not about criticizing the staple we know and love. It's about seeing why they exist, where they came from, and what assumptions they carry. These archetypes, particularly codified in D&D, are hyper-westernized interpretations shaped by European myths and medieval tropes, and are not universally accessible or culturally neutral. They are useful because they give players a familiar foundation, but they can and should be taken apart, reinterpreted, and rebuilt. Just as the monk has evolved into the brawler and the barbarian has become the fury in Draw Steel, so too can every class be adapted to better serve the story and function of the players. TTRPGs are at their core storytelling tools, and when the classes function thoroughly, they enhance narrative, character, and play. By understanding the cultural and historical lenses that shaped these archetypes, we gain the freedom to break the mold, experiment, craft new stories and new classes. Through this, we can create classes that really resonate with today's players, whilst honouring the imaginative legacy of the past. And now that we've finished talking about their origin, it only seems fitting that we go on to the next part. What makes a good or a bad class? At the beginning of the video, we talked about what classes actually are. That they're a package of abilities that allow you to access an archetype that you wish to play, that you've seen through mythology, literature, and culture. This is, however, but one piece of the pie. Whilst also allowing you to play this archetype, it also has to work within the game itself. A good class system will allow you to play your archetype that you envision, create the character you want to play, whilst also harmonizing with all of the various other classes that your other players might play as. You should be able to have strengths and weaknesses that are matched and accounted for by your other players. Your class should make you feel different on a mechanical and a roleplay element, enabling you to reach the higher points of roleplay whilst also allowing you to have a specific role in combat. Good examples of this is the fact that the bard fills a support role, boosting the people around it whilst using its magical abilities to tease and debuff the enemies in front of it. Added to this, there is the elephant in the room that we haven't discussed yet, which is that classes need to fit the world they're set in. And this comes with our largest problem and the main reason why we're talking about this at all. If I pick up the fantastic Dune TTRPG by Modiphius Entertainment, I will find in there a whole bunch of classes that perfectly fit the setting. They fit the setting because Dune by its nature has an easier job of things. Dune simply has to replicate the ideas and philosophies that fit within the book, and then balance them and harmonize them against the other ideas within the book. I don't go into Dune looking for a druid package. There is no druids in the world of Dune. Dune would be failing as a class system if it offered me one, for it would be taking me out of the world and disconnecting me with it. Daggerheart, D&D, and Draw Steel all have a much harder job. All three of these games are trying to be the staple fantasy. They want to be the game that you go to and pick up anytime you want to play fantasy TTRPGs, and in doing that, they have to be vastly accessible to any kind of fantasy world you envision. This was one of the reasons why I was so harsh on Daggerheart's class system, because Daggerheart does a fantastic job at broadening the horizon and accessibility for homebrew by providing different frames that you can access It means that it is encouraging you to make your own homebrew world and build each one to be different. By having its own system, it asks for a level of uniformity between these frames, but at the same time that is up to your ability and your desire to homebrew. The classes, however, are something that are a core gameplay mechanic. Changing them from frame to frame is much harder than changing roleplay or immersive elements such as what people eat, how the Draconia look, how the Infernus look, how the Qatari act, so on and so forth. These can be changed at the drop of a hat. Changing a class, though, is much harder, and if a class restricts you from being able to access typical fantasy tropes or your vision of what you want your world to be able to do, it is failing. D&D has a massive advantage in this. As D&D has been around for so long, it has a vast array of subclasses for people to access. You can pretty much build anything in D&D basically by the subclasses that it has already. Daggerheart and Draw Steel will catch up on this, of course, but they have to be able to meet the general expectations. Draw Steel has its own problems. Its depiction of the Fury is based around an ability rather than a cornerstone element. The Fury is based on the abilities of knocking people around, sending people back, and you spend your Fury points to access that ability and to use it better with other combinations. This is really cool from a mechanical gameplay point of view, but it hyper-constricts you in your depiction of your Fury. Instead of being something based on rage, you instead have to be something that roleplays or works well with the idea of knocking people around. This has its benefits and its negatives. Daggerheart also has that restriction. Within its Seraph class, you're left with the options of being a winged Seraph or being a Seraph with a turning weapon. That massively hamstrings you if you envision any other kind of paladin at all. And if your world doesn't gel with those two ideas, you're struggling. In their nature, classes should be massively adaptable. To give you an example of this, one of my favourite characters that I created was a bard by the name of Advar Dilara. In Advar's backstory, he had been down on his money, and after agreeing to an experimental cult ritual, instead woke up with a strange metallic gauntlet that had been fused to the very flesh of his left hand. This gauntlet could not be removed, and rang with a strange noise whenever anything clashed against it. This became my cornerstone of Advar's powers. Rather than him playing through instruments, Advar would smash his sword against it, create a ringing noise, as he then fired that sound off, which caused spells like Shatter and so on and so forth. This required a little bit of me working against the preconceptions defined in Bard, but I still ended up with something that felt my own, and still ended up with something that I wanted to be when I started. I tried to do the same thing with Daggerheart and came across some difficulties specifically in the Seraph and Rogue classes. When I tried to build a character who had his entire story being that he had gone into death and right before dying had come across a deity called the Old Companion, a god whose whole purpose was that he sat down with you at the moment of your death, talked through your life, and gave you peace before you passed on. This character was obsessed with the Old Companion and had decided to go out and commit his life to spreading the word of the Old Companion. He did this by moving from place to place and following the path of a chicken that he decided was his prophet. I tried to create this in a Seraph and ended up constantly coming against the issues of not wanting to have the wing power, for it clashed with the ragged prophet image I had. So too did the returning weapon, which clashed with this image. I was forced to make my character as a warrior and multi-class to make this happen. Now, multi-classing is always an option and is something that is there. In my mind though, I do feel like classes should sort of stand on their own feet. That's just one of my things that I think is a bit my opinion. I think it comes from the fact that the classes, if they embody an archetype or a basis for an archetype, should allow the fluidity within them to become whatever version of an archetype you want. You shouldn't really have to multi-class to get what you want to do. At most, you should subclass. Now, my opinions on this are very based on what we enjoy here at Badger Tales, which is roleplay and character focus, enabling players to get the best character they want. It's very easy for me to sit here and criticize Daggerheart, Draw Steel, all of these, give my review and give my feedback. At the end of the day, it is what suits you and what you are looking for from your TTRPG. In my mind, the best way to fix Daggerheart's system would have been, instead of having each class instantly be connected to 2 domains, instead having each class be connected to 1 domain and have the subclasses give you extra abilities and then access an additional domain. This would require heavy changing, probably would end up with the ranger actually removing as a class and becoming a subclass of the fighter, and would have other rippling effects all around. In my mind, I think it would work better, but I don't know. I'm basing this off my opinions and my judgment on what I think would work and what I don't think would work. The reality of each of these games is they each offer something very different from the kind of player or GM you want to be. Games that I feel do character classes quite well, in my opinion, tend to be things like Blades in the Dark or City of Mist or Forbidden Lands, things that give you a broader connection to a class idea that you then build from, getting access to abilities but allowing you to kind of make them your own. I prefer that, but that's just my opinion. I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I really, really, really want to reiterate that if you disagree with us, if you disagree with anything we've said here, if you don't like it, talk to us. We want to talk to you, and we want to debate things, all things TTRPG. If you want to play games with us, we run games at www.badgertales.co.uk. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. We have a whole ton more content coming up on the horizon, including reviews for Draw of Steel, D&D, and many, many, many other games. My brain is bursting with the various games that I cannot wait to get to. Just wait till I get to City of Mist, Defiant, Household. So many great games to come. What's more, we talk a lot of world building and storytelling stuff, so if you're looking for advice or just being a part of that conversation, we'd love to talk with you. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion with us. If you disagree with us, like I said before, jump into the comments, talk with us. We're always wanting to talk about this stuff, and we're always ready to be proved wrong. If you disagreed, absolutely talk me through things. I really want to hear your opinion. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time, as I am now going to get back to Wuthering Heights, because I do not believe the movie has matched what is going on.